So this is going to be a talk about Stenring, not about my own personal views on the subject, and I haven't put any personal views in. So all our assumptions about ancient history in the Middle East depend on our understanding of the when, and this ultimate chronology was based on the Bible. Egyptologists, conventional Egyptologists and archaeologists have long since moved away from the biblical chronology of Archbishop Usher and feel free to lengthen or shorten the Judges period, cast doubt on the monarchy period, and treat the earlier biblical stories as mythological. Biblical dates are no longer accepted unless they are confirmed in records of other nations. But revisionists do place a lot of reliance on biblical dates. Presumably, they believe that the chronological information is contemporary with the stories in which they are embedded. I'm going to show you that this assumption cannot possibly be correct. I have no reason to disbelieve that the stories themselves are ancient and perhaps even contemporary with the events that they describe. But the chronological information was added probably in the 3rd century BC. For example, these opening verses about Moses read like a traditional tale. We are not told the name of the mother and father of the child, and it is not until Exodus chapter 6 verse 20 that she's named Jochebed, literally the daughter of Levi, and he is her nephew Amram. So Moses is not just descended from Levites who have been in Egypt for hundreds of years, he is Levi's actual grandson. This information is located within a slab of chronological data that has been quite clumsily inserted into the middle of God's instructions to Moses. It is these chronological details that form a coherent system. Knut Stenring published his book, The Enclosed Garden, in 1965. In it, he revealed the chronological structure that has been built into the Bible. Professor Gerhard Larsen examined Stenring's findings and submitted them to mathematical analysis. This chronological system is embedded in the Masoretic text, but it dates much earlier than this canon. The Masoretic text is a medieval Hebrew canon which was made more accessible to readers by the addition of vowels. There is no suggestion that the text was reworked at that time, and it is not clear at what point the individual books were amalgamated into a single canon. The Masoretic text was translated into our modern Protestant Bibles, and it is in this version that Stenring discovered the chronology. Before explaining Stenring's findings, I would like to mention some other versions of the Bible, as revisionists sometimes treat the Septuagint as a superior authority for chronological matters when the two books diverge. For example, David Rohl, in A Test of Time, quotes the Septuagint for the length of the sojourn in Egypt on the grounds that it is hundreds of years more ancient than the Masoretic text. The Septuagint is a Greek translation of a Hebrew text, and it is still used in the Eastern Orthodox Church. It is from the 1st century AD historian Josephus that we have the story of how King Ptolemy II arranged to obtain translations of the Jewish books of law for the library at Alexandria. He freed 100,000 Hebrew slaves and sent costly gifts to the temple in Jerusalem. In return, he asked the high priest Eleazar to send 72 elders, 6 from each tribe, to Alexandria, and to bring with them the Hebrew holy books to translate into Greek. I have no idea why it's called the Septuagint and not the Septuagint II, but that's what it's called. Modern scholars treat this story as legend and suggest that the Greek-speaking Jews of Alexandria had forgotten how to read Hebrew and wanted to read their holy books in the vernacular. Josephus claimed that the Septuagint was so well received that from then on no word was to be altered. But Josephus himself did not appear to believe that the integrity of this translation had been preserved, because in his own version of Jewish history, The Antiquity of the Jews, he quite often used the Hebrew version rather than the Greek, where these differed. He also emphasized that the words of the Hebrew text were divine and venerable. The Samaritan Pentateuch seems to be based on the Septuagint, and biblical scholars date it to the 1st century BC. In it, there are many instances where contradictions which remain in the Hebrew and Septuagint texts have been edited out, indicating that it is a later copy. The Masoretic canon is thought to be made up of books that originally stood alone, and that these books were redacted at various times. Biblical scholars identify the Yahwist J, the Elohist E, the priestly source P, and the Deuteronomist D. Stenring believed there was an earlier version comprising just 15 of the books of the Old Testament in which he found all the chronological data. By analogy, Gerhard Larsen calls this chronology C, and that's the term that I use in this presentation. Stenring thought that these books were originally arranged as 12 books, and that the text has been preserved unchanged since that time. What connects these 12 books is the 300 events which Stenring identified that were required to reconstruct the chronology. Stenring's reconstruction of the system resolves all the apparent contradictions in chronological information that occur in different books of the Bible, such as the date that Nebuchadnezzar burnt down Jerusalem. In previous articles and letters published in Review and Workshop, I have discussed the reliability of Stenring's chronology in relation to actual historical dates. Today I will talk mainly about the system. The features of the system are that regnal years or ages are counted exactly to the day. Any internal contradictions, such as Seth's age at the birth of his son or the date Jerusalem was burnt down, if it was not a scribal error, must mean that 2 calendars were being used. Stenring discovered that in fact 3 different calendars are employed in the chronology, all running from the first day of creation. And it is important to realize that these calendars are the tools of the redactor. They do not represent any of the calendars in use at the time being written about. Stenring names the 3 calendars lunar, solar, and standard, and I use symbols similar to his in the tables in this presentation. The lunar calendar has 354 days of 12 months, alternating 30 days, 29 days, with no intercalary month. The solar calendar has 365 days of 12 months of 30 days, followed by 5 days. The standard calendar is exactly the same, except an extra day is added in the 4th year. The calendars all begin on the same day and run parallel from the beginning, or era mundus. So the same day can be counted in 3 different ways. Adam's birthday is at sunset between days 6 and 7 in the lunar calendar, 6 days from the beginning. Whichever calendar is used in C chronology to date an event, the date on the other 2 calendars can be calculated by you or me by simple arithmetic. Just to clarify how an event on a particular day can be expressed in 3 different calendars. Adam was 130 years old when Seth was born. So Seth's date of birth is 7/1/131, which is 130 times 354 plus 7 days, or 46,027 days. To translate the date into solar years, divide by 365. And to translate the date into standard years, divide by 365.25. So the structure of the chronology is not just significant dates, but significant spans of time that are a feature of the chronology, especially 40 days, 40 years, but I will not be discussing that aspect. C chronology is composed of 300 events spread through 12 books, spanning 3,300 solar years from era mundus. Event 100 is the Exodus. Event 50 is the death of Noah. Event 300 is the Feast of Tabernacles, celebrated in Jerusalem when the exiles returned from Babylon. There are 12 heads of mankind among the patriarchs who outlive their descendants, and this is one of Stenring's own illustrations. He drew them all by hand, including the front cover, which I showed you earlier. Shem, the son of Noah, was born 100 years before the flood and died when Jacob was 64 years old. So he outlived 8 of his descendants. The divided monarchy period is divided into 70 episodes, separated by dominion and slavery, life and death, in Stenring's words. There are 20 rulers of Israel and 20 rulers of Judah, preceded by 4 rulers over all Israel. The Feast of Tabernacles is the final event in C chronology, event 300. When the Jews returned from 70 years' exile in Babylon, they gathered in the 7th month in Jerusalem. They built an altar before the foundations of the temple had been laid, and offered burnt offerings from the first day of the month leading up to the Day of Atonement on the 14th day of the 7th month, followed on the 15th day by the Feast of Tabernacles. The feast date falls in the lunar calendar. In the solar calendar, this same day is the last day of the 3,300th year since Era Mundus. It was several years after Stenring had completed his research that he realized the link between event 300 and the new leap year calendar introduced by Ptolemy III Euergetes. It is exactly 300 Sothic or Egyptian civil years before the 1st of Thoth, 239 BC, which is the first month of the year in which the Canopus decree was dated. New Year in Egypt was celebrated at that time at the heliacal rising of Sirius, so outside the calendar. It rose a day later every 4 years in the Egyptian calendar, according to the Canopus decree, although not invariably so in reality. The Canopus decree proclaimed that a leap year would be introduced to lock the heliacal rising of Sirius to the date the 1st of Peni in the Egyptian civil calendar. Henceforth the star would always rise on that date instead of wandering through the calendar, thus converting the Egyptian solar calendar into a standard Julian calendar. The first of Peni is the first day of the 10th month in the Egyptian civil calendar. And as you see, event 300 in C chronology finishes on day 1 of the 10th month in the standard calendar. Stenring had originally calculated that C chronology must have begun in 3836 BC, Saturday night, April the 9th, Julian calendar to be precise, in order for the 3 calendars to start together near the vernal equinox. Event 300 was within a year of a well-known historical event, the accession of Cyrus, which enabled Stenring to judge the accuracy of the date. The number of solar years from the 1st of Thoth, 239 BC, to Era Mundus is exactly 3,600. In the C chronology, Sabbaths, Sabbath years, and Jubilees are correctly dated where they are mentioned. So, for example, Ezekiel's prophecies always fall on the eve of Sabbath or Sabbath. Athaliah's murder took place on the Sabbath, the day that Joash became king. It is day 1,086,631, a number divisible by 7. The first sabbatical year is the year the Israelites crossed the Jordan. That's Leviticus 25:2. Jubilees appear to be every 50 years, as required in Leviticus chapter 25, rather than 49 years, as in the book of Jubilees. Seasons are dated correctly on the standard calendar, even when the date might be quoted on the solar or lunar calendar. The seasons are based on a calendar starting in the vernal equinox. For example, the Philistines returned the ark to Beth Shemesh during wheat harvest, or June in the standard calendar. The spies were sent into Canaan when the grapes first ripened on which is 20th of July in Julian years, and returned 40 days later with pomegranates, figs, and a huge bunch of grapes, needing 2 men to carry it, which works out at the 1st of September. The 7 years of famine foreseen by Joseph begin the first day of the month of wheat harvest in the standard calendar, although the years for that period in C chronology are actually counted in the lunar calendar. Exodus falls in the autumn on the standard calendar. Gerhard Larsen points out that the 10 plagues before Exodus are all possible in autumn in Egypt, but for the ripe barley to be destroyed while the wheat had not grown up would not normally occur, because both crops are sown together in winter and harvested in spring, although the wheat does take longer to ripen. Larsson's explanation is that Ptolemy II introduced irrigation around Alexandria in the 3rd century BC. This allowed barley to be sown in summer under irrigation after the wheat had been harvested in spring. Larsson tested whether Stenring really had uncovered a hidden chronology. Gerhard Larsson published his own book, The Secret System, in 1973. He was a mathematician, not a biblical scholar, and the tests he applied were mathematical. As he put it, Mr. Knut Stenring does not claim they are one possible solution. He is very definite that they are the solution, not of the real chronology, but of the system used in the main part of the Old Testament. But the first proof is that it does work. It clears up inconsistencies. For example, this explains how Shem could be 100 at the flood and still 100 2 years later. We are told that Noah was 500 lunar years old. Well, we're told he was 500 years old, they're lunar years, when Shem was born, the blue lunar dates. And the flood began on the 17th day of the 2nd month in his 600th year, the red lunar date. The earth is dry again on the 27th day of the 2nd month, the red date which falls in the standard calendar. Coincidentally, this is 11/3 in the lunar calendar, the first purple date. Exactly 2 lunar years later, Arphaxad is born, the second purple date. Coincidentally, this is Shem's 100th birthday in the standard calendar, which are the green dates. So Noah's age is recorded in lunar years, but Shem's in standard years. The flood begins and ends on the correct dates, and Arphaxad is born exactly 2 lunar years after the earth is dry. Larsson worked out the probability of events surrounding the Exodus falling on the dates listed by chance. Stenring had to work out a lot of the dates, and because the information could be on any of 3 calendars, there are a number of alternatives. Notice that the dates are drawn from 4 different books of the Bible, yet they all match to the day. The red text is the information from the Bible. We are told that Aaron died in the 40th year after the Exodus, which falls in the solar calendar, but the dates are leading to the crossing of the Jordan on the 10th in the lunar calendar, and the first Passover in Israel. In this period, all the patriarchs except Shem are born and die on 11/3 lunar, so Stenring guessed that Aaron's birth and death would too. His lunar age provides the coincidental date that he was born at Passover in the solar calendar, which is the green date in the middle calendar. Moses was 80 when he came before Pharaoh, a few days before the Exodus, on 3/1 in the solar calendar. This provides his date of birth 80 years before in the solar calendar, which coincides with 11/3 in the lunar calendar. So those are the brown dates in the middle column, and 11/3 in the lunar calendar. All the information about when manna began to fall and when it ended also fits. According to Exodus 16:26, it began to fall on the first day of the week. So Larsson calculated the probability of these dates concerning Exodus all fitting by chance if the chronological system was not actually applied during the final redaction. And the bottom line is 1 to 75,000. I didn't think you'd want to wade all the way through that. Larsson calculated that the probability of the whole chronology fitting by chance was nearly 1 in 10 million. So we'll look now at how well C chronology fits known historical dates. Stenring placed the start of the chronology at 3836 BC. The nearer events are to the time of the redactors in the 3rd century, the closer they are to conventional dates, although that may be tautological if the Bible assisted the dating. So the accession of Cyrus is 539 BC compared to 538, and the death of Josiah in 610 compared to 609. One of the underlying purposes of C chronology appears to be the desire to hit significant dates. Hezekiah's Passover feast in the first year of his reign was delayed to month 2 because the temple had to be cleaned and sanctified after it was defiled in his father's reign, and the purification was not completed until the 16th, 2 days after Passover. So the postponed feast falls on 14/2 in the solar calendar, but the date is actually 10 years before his father's death. There is no mention of a co-regency in the Bible, and there are other ways to arrange the synchronisms, but this particular synchronism seems to be the one intended. Historically, the details described in 2 Chronicles could not possibly have occurred while Hezekiah's father still reigned, nor could it occur before the fall of Samaria, which seems to be referred to indirectly when Hezekiah says, "Our sons, daughters, and wives are in captivity." The hidden date is in the standard calendar. It is on the cusp of a new century, exactly 500 years before the retroactive date of 3600 or 239 BC. This one's a bit last minute. I've realigned C chronology to the fall of Samaria so that you can see how differently Tila has aligned the synchronisms between Israel and Judah. Biblical scholars such as Tila have to assume the existence of co-regencies, even when they are not mentioned. The lighter shading represents the co-regnal years of the junior regent or a deposed king or rival reigns. So the red is Tila's version and the blue is Stenring's version. Co-regencies are a tool of the chronologist. They are needed to make biblical synchronisms fit or to make them synchronize with Assyrian dates. The green shading represents the regnal years of Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria. Instead of giving Hezekiah the co-regency, Tila gives it to his son Manasseh. This shortens Manasseh's 55-year reign to 45 years. The C chronology needs Manasseh's full 55-year reign, as well as the 10 years of Hezekiah's co-regency, in order to hit that significant date, 500 years before the retroactive era of C. The Bible mentions Tiglath-Pileser, and his annals name the biblical kings Ahaz, Pekah, Hoshea, and Rezin of Damascus. Tila also accepts the identification of Menahem and Azariah. C chronology gives Menahem, Pekahiah, and Pekah their full combined 32-year reign, and both Menahem and Azariah are earlier than Tiglath-Pileser. But since Shalmaneser III's annals name Jehu as a vassal in year 18, there were not enough years between Shalmaneser's reign and Tiglath-Pileser's to accommodate Menahem and Azariah in full. Tila therefore assumes that Pekah has a rival reign to Menahem and Pekahiah, which reduces his chronology by 12 years. And Tiglath-Pileser's use of the term Menahem of Samaria compared to Pekah of Bit Umria, literally Omriland or Israel, lends support to the argument that they did have rival reigns. The fall of Samaria shows only a 10-year difference, accounted for by Manasseh's co-regency or its absence. By the time the division of the kingdom, there is a 30-year difference. The C chronologist did not seem concerned with historical accuracy, and dates become more doubtful the further back in time they are. But this does not deter revisionists. David Rohl does it best, so I'm going to have a quick look at the way he dates the Sojourn and Exodus. In A Test of Time, he follows Velikovsky in accepting that there were 480 years between Solomon's year 4 and the Exodus. David uses Tila's date of 931 BC for Solomon's death. So year 4 is 966, David's maths, and Exodus is 1447 BC. In C chronology, Solomon died in 963 BC, 32 years before Tila's calculated date. But his 40-year reign includes an 11-year co-regency with David. So month 2, year 4 falls in his sole reign in the lunar calendar and is therefore 988 BC. Exodus is 479 solar years earlier, which is 1467 BC. David Rohl used the duration of the sojourn in Egypt to calculate when Joseph lived. The Bible says the sojourn in Egypt lasted 430 years, but the Septuagint includes the sojourn of the patriarchs in Canaan within that period. David resorts to Josephus's claim that the sojourn in Egypt lasted only 215 years, exactly half the Bible total. David points out that Josephus was in possession of original documents from the destroyed temple in Jerusalem, which gave weight to his version. But actually, David and Josephus needed to look no further than the Bible and the Septuagint, which agree chapter and verse. That Abraham left Haran when he was 75, and Isaac was born in Canaan when Abraham was 100, so 25 years later. Jacob was born when Isaac was 60, and Jacob was 130 when he entered Egypt. The total is 215 years for the patriarch's sojourn in Canaan. Josephus then followed the Septuagint by calculating that the sojourn in Egypt must also have been 215 years. William Whiston, who published his translation of Josephus in 1737 AD, expressed his bemusement why the Masoretic text should have abridged the Septuagint. But did they? How long is 430 years of sojourn in sea chronology? I did explain in my recent review article, but it's in note 60, so you may have missed it. It is the sum of the years that the 4 generations of Levi, son of Jacob, Kohath, son of Levi, Amram, son of Kohath, and Aaron, son of Amram, sojourned in Egypt. When I wrote that, I had not done the calculations. I just totted up the years to check Stenring's claim that they added up to 430 solar years, approximately. Looking at it again, it did not seem quite right, because the numbers do not add up to exactly 430 years. And I wondered if it was meant to be the actual number of days. The text in the Bible emphasizes even the self-same day it came to pass. So I did the maths. It is indeed the exact number of days that each individual spent in Egypt, added together and divided by 365. So I hope you've begun to appreciate just how many separate pieces of information are required to work out the exact day on which each of these people were born, arrived in Egypt, and died there or left Egypt. The sojourn in sea chronology lasted 196 years, not 430. It began in 1662 BC. Exactly the same date that David Rohl calculated. But all that this means is that the 3rd century translators of the Hebrew text into Greek used the same sources to arrive at the same point in time. Since there is no evidence the sources were independent, there can be no confidence it reinforces the accuracy of the biblical data. So to conclude, when was sea chronology created? The data was drawn from 15 books in the Bible that together form a system that fits to the day. It is inconceivable that such a chronology could have been developed piecemeal. Differences in the 3rd century Septuagint can be explained as a tidying up of the seemingly illogical or contradictory Hebrew system. It seems unlikely that it was the Septuagint that was altered into sea canon. The books of sea canon have been preserved unchanged in the Masoretic text. It is linked to the Canopus Decree 238 BC, when there was a large Jewish population in Alexandria, and agricultural descriptions show familiarity with 3rd century Egypt. The 3rd century BC was the period of great interest in history and chronology. Berosus wrote a Babylonian history, Manetho wrote the history of Egypt, and Eratosthenes, the librarian at Alexandria, wrote a history from Troy to his own day. The structure of these works is similar to the Old Testament. My research of this period has not enabled me to understand the circumstances in which sea chronology could have been created. The secret seems to have been lost soon after, until Stenring unlocked it 2,200 years later. That's it. That's all I have to say on the subject at this point in time. And if you were thoroughly lost, I'm assuming that the tables will be put up on the web page, and you can study them at your leisure, which is why I packed so many of them in.
Sounds very impressive, the work you've done.
Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any questions?
One question is there any way of explaining these extraordinarily long lives, or the figures for these long lives?
Well, if you look, I was going to put in a section about the patriarchs, but I decided it would make it too long. I did show you the heads of mankind and how their numbers are added up. They fall before the flood and after the flood. I mean, it's just opinion. You can form your own. I would say that the significance of the long lives is to create that 3,600 years that they were aiming for, which is a Babylonian number of great significance. And that is a whole topic that was just too much. I couldn't fit it into the time. But you know, I think that's a completely different area of research. It's probably more anthropological. I mean, another suggestion to you is that, I mean, if you want to consider the numbers as more or less real, is that they belong to dynasties or clans in the same way as Manetho's, and I haven't read Berosus, so I don't know what he was doing.
Could they be using equinoctial years? Because if you halve everything, it makes much more sense. Like Sarah giving birth to Isaac, age of 90, halve that, 44.
Well,
that's much more realistic.
I mean, you can say that a number is realistic, that 130 years isn't realistic, that 65 is, but that isn't what they were aiming at. And my purpose in showing you these numbers was to show that they were not interested. I don't think the numbers have been inserted to create any kind of realism. They had a different objective. I do not know what their objective was. It's something to do with the sacredness of the number itself. And I have to say, when I added up all those days, you know, of the Sojourn, and found that when you added them all together and divided by 365, it came to 430 with no remainder, that sent a shiver down my spine. And I think that is supposed to be awesome for people in on the secret. Wow, you know. I don't know what their purpose was, but
you see in other countries a similar sort of attempt to stretch the history.
Yeah.
Egyptian history, clearly the early years, you know, exaggerated. Assyrian history is the same, where the early years are clearly exaggerated. Even Greek history. So there seems to have been some, whether it was a competition or whatever. But everybody wants, you know, you can look at each of these histories and say they're clearly stretched, particularly the early parts. The guys.
Larson did suggest that.
Were doing the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, Larson suggested that the Septuagint was adapted from the C canon in order to adjust the lengths of the patriarchs' ages, so that the flood was moved earlier, because in the Hebrew version you have Egyptian kings. The dynasty 1 starts before the flood, and that's not possible. So the Septuagint version actually lifts the numbers up. In other words, taking account of what Manetho said the dates were. I think they were all just, I don't know whether it was a competition or whether I mean, there's a lot of Greek interest in numbers, and I think that's where a lot of the interest comes from.
It's quite likely as well that by 200 BC or something like that in Alexandria, most of these histories were available. The Egyptian one, the Hebrew, they were, you know, scholars were aware of all of them.
Well, they were all in the library, weren't they, at Alexandria? They were all sitting around a big table, working it all out.
Exactly. So if one's extended, the other one stretches to meet it.
Yeah.
The Arab historians recorded reigns of 500-600 years for the Amalekite together, presumably on a similar basis. They had a lot of time, what they felt was historical time, to fill up.
Yes,
and
exactly.
They filled it up by giving people these very long lives. The same applied to the Amalekites when they were still in Arabia.
But the patriarchs before the flood, I think there are 10 patriarchs before the flood, and that is the same as the Babylonian numbers. And of course, Abraham is someone who came from Babylonia, so you would expect his ancestry to be, to be the same. So it's consistent from that point of view, but it's borrowed basically from Babylonia. I think one can just guess what their purpose was.
The ages of death are fairly consistent, but the ages of the birth of their sons have been manipulated out of sight.
Yes.
And I'm happy to think that the manipulation occurred around 238 BC. And I think, and this is from my analysis angle rather than anything to do with what you've been talking about, I think at that stage they were aware of the Venus cycle, because the Exodus date is obviously related to the Venus cycle, and also you've got other dates, the date for the start of the reign of Saul, and the Venus event and the death of Saul fits the Venus cycle.
Well, that may refer to the Septuagint version, because it's the Septuagint version that alters the ages of when the sons were born. But I mean, you can put your own interpretation on that.
What it means is that they had a structure from the Venus cycle, and then they fitted the numbers.
Yes, but that's in the Septuagint, and this refers to the Masoretic text.
Surely the one thing you can read into this is that they didn't believe that at all, because they based all these dates on their current view of the world, the lunar solar cycles. So they were fundamentally accepting that the world had not changed in terms of solar and lunar cycles. They were projecting everything back using the way of the world they perceived at the time.
I think it's important. I mean, the whole point of my talk and my presentation was to point out that the dates that we have, the chronology we have this hidden purpose of aligning the lunar, the solar, and the proto-Julian calendar to particular days of significance. I mean, we might not know what's significant about the dates, but they were.
On a different subject, what was the date of Stenring's publication?
1965.
1965, okay, so he'd been presumably well aware that the Septuagint text is well supported in many areas by Hebrew texts from, he might not be aware actually, it depends on the publication date, from the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yes, indeed.
It doesn't seem necessarily as
but the point is that our current, a lot of people argue, including David Rohl, that the Hebrew text is a copy of the Septuagint, but it doesn't actually make sense. The kinds of differences don't make sense if you looked at it that way around. And we know, because the only evidence we have about the Septuagint is that it was a copy of a Hebrew text. It was copied from the Hebrew, and the point about this is that those books are still included in the Bible.
I hesitate to correct you, but I think it's a mistake to talk about the Hebrew. One thing we learned from the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the many things, is that there wasn't the Hebrew text. There were many Hebrew texts. There were many versions of the Hebrew text.
Yes.
And the Septuagint translated one strand.
But as I tried to point out, Stenring found 300 events. Not 301, not 299. He found 300 events which made up 3,600 years. And he drew those from our Bible, 15 different books, and he supposed that they were originally only 12. I mean, it's a fair supposition that Samuel 1 and 2 were once one book, Kings 1 and 2 were once one book, but whether there were 12 or whether there were 15, we know that Ezra was part of 2 Chronicles, because the last few verses of 2 Chronicles are repeated in Ezra. So the chronology he found was within those books. So he's saying that we've got a lot of books added now. Is it 42 or something? I can't remember. Do you know how many books there are, David, in the Old Testament? There are a lot more anyway. But of these, but those 12 books where he found, or 15 books where he found that chronology, he's suggesting did form a canon. Why else, after 2,000 years, have we still, can you still identify those? So they were early books. Yes, the books have been altered and there were different versions, but those particular chronological pieces of information are still all there. Okay.